Of the on the series in supporting STEM graduate education in Georgia, funded by the State Department. Today's we'll have two speakers. The first will be Mr. Irakli Malania from the U.S. Embassy, speaking about U.S. government support of exchange programs between Georgia and the U.S. And the second will be Distinguished Professor Sanford Bernstein from San Diego State University, who has been teaching a similar course funded by the National Institutes of Health at San Diego State. So we're lucky to have both of those people talk to us today. At the beginning, I would like to ask Ms. Magda Magradzi, the Chief Executive Officer of the Millennium Foundation, to say a few things. She and her office have been supporters of SDSU Georgia and of the overall effort to help improve STEM education at the undergraduate and graduate levels in Georgia. And she's been extremely helpful, and we really appreciate her help. Magda, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Rochelle. Good evening and good morning, dear colleagues. It is always a great pleasure for me to welcome you. It has been now, I think, 6 meetings that we have on the topic of supporting STEM research for future Georgian scientists and scholars. This is a very important project that is funded by the U.S. Embassy and U.S. Department of State, and I want to thank our colleagues from U.S. Embassy for their continuous support of San Diego State University and its work in Georgia. So this is a very exciting opportunity, actually, that has emerged outside the Millennium Challenge Corporation Compact, which I'm sure you're all aware of what the project has been with MCC, Millennium Challenge Corporation. So it's really wonderful to see that San Diego State University is not going anywhere. There are some rumors that SDSU is closing and etc. But no, San Diego State University continues to work in Georgia. Dr. Guven is here with us, and he and his team continue to be offering U.S. degree programs in Georgia with new cohorts of graduates. But in addition to this work, San Diego State University is also implementing other projects. And today we are witnessing one of the projects that we are jointly working on. So from the Millennium Foundation perspective, it is our honor and privilege to support any activities that San Diego State University launches in Georgia. Our tertiary education director, Dr. Surguladze, Nodar Surguladze, is here online, and he's been working with SDSU and Dr. Rochelle's team to make sure that this project supporting STEM research and graduate education is a success. And I want to thank everyone who's involved in the project implementation and encourage all the colleagues who are attending our today's webinar to make sure that this opportunity is well utilized. And last but not least, again, I want to thank the US government, US Embassy, and San Diego State University for continuous partnership and excellent work in Georgia. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Magda. It's been a great pleasure working with you. And indeed, our intention is, and our president's intention is, to stay in Georgia and support STEM research for as long as we can be useful. Thanks again. I'd next like to ask Dr. Christopher Anderson from the U.S. Embassy, who is the cultural attaché, to say a few words. Christopher with us?
Unfortunately, he could not attend this meeting.
Okay. Good. We had a long, not good, sorry. But we have a very long agenda today, as you see. We will hear from him next time, I'm sure. Next, I'd like to ask Dr. Guven, who is the Dean of SDSU Georgia and co-PI on the State Department grant to support graduate level STEM education in Georgia, to say a few things. Halil?
Yeah, thank you, Walt. I would like to welcome all of you to another mini course, which I find extremely interesting and engaging. So thanks for participating. And I just wanted to briefly, since we have a loaded agenda, briefly say that 19th April is the deadline for applications for PhD students that would like to do research in San Diego. And there are 18 slots available throughout Georgia for researchers to go to San Diego. So please inform your students, or those of your students, please turn in your applications. This is the way San Diego State, Georgia is here, so we can be the bridge. So if you have any questions, feel free to connect with us. We're in Tbilisi, as you know. But at the same time, as you have heard in the previous mini course, joint doctoral program directors that run the 15 doctoral programs that was presented earlier are expecting your applications. And if you have any questions, you can write to them. And also, I think Dr. Rochelle offered that you can CC him on your emails. So key here is to apply. So please do apply. And I wish a good mini conference today and look forward to your applications to go to San Diego in the fall. By fall, another good news that by June 15, 2021, it was announced in the news today that California will be open. So by June 15th of this year, things will be back to normal in San Diego. So we hope that by that time you have received your grant, and you can apply for visa and you can travel mid-August. So this is coming to the close. Today is the 7th, so there is 12 more days. Please do apply. That's my last word. Have a good conference, and I have to leave at 8:30. I'm sorry, but I'll stay until the time to move to another meeting.
Thank you, Halil, for those comments and for reminding everybody about the opportunity to spend some time at San Diego State working on your graduate research with a professor in San Diego State. The most important contact that you can make is with a professor in San Diego State, and the joint doctoral directors can be a bridge to that. I can be a bridge, Halil can be a bridge, but also feel free to look on the web and reach out directly to faculty at San Diego State and introduce yourself. And if you would copy me on your correspondence, at least your initial correspondence, that would be good, because if questions come up, I can help answer them or help facilitate the interaction. I think it's a fantastic opportunity. Basically, there's a stipend associated with it, your travel, support from SDSU Georgia on your visa, and it's a real chance to work with a state-of-the-art lab for some period of time of at least 3 months at San Diego State over the next year or two. So thank you again, Halil. I won't take any more time right now, so we can move on with the agenda. I'll just introduce Mr. Irakli Melania from the State Department and from the U.S. Embassy in Tbilisi, and thank him for attending. It's nice to meet you, and he'll tell us a bit about U.S. government support of exchange program opportunities between Georgia and the U.S.
Thanks a lot. Thank you very much for your kind introduction. It's a great pleasure of mine to be here this evening. I just want to clarify with Anna that you would like me to make this presentation in English, right?
That would be great. Yeah.
Perfect. Perfect. Thank you. With the US Embassy, I'm sure Chris will join one of these meetings. Unfortunately, he had to leave Tbilisi. He's currently not in Tbilisi, so that's why probably there was some miscommunication with Anna, but hopefully we can sort it out easily and he can attend one of the next meetings. From our side, I represent the Public Affairs Office here at the Embassy, which works on wide variety of topics covering starting from the media, going into educational programs and also grants programs. I'm the kind of new member of the team. Today I was supposed to join by my colleague Tea Gujokhidze, but unfortunately she's taken an extended leave. But today my main reason is to talk to you about Fulbright programs. And Fulbright is for us an umbrella program which encompasses lots of the professional development programs, including ones that are offered to scholars. In general, the US government in Georgia is implementing education programs from 1993. So in a year, we work close to 20 exchange programs and send around 200 exchange students. The way that these programs are organized, that they are categorized on based on age groups. And by age groups, I mean that there are programs that are offered to high school students and then going into the undergraduate and graduate levels. Unfortunately, the level that we normally do not touch is a PhD level and PhD degrees, because an assumption is that and if a student from Georgia gets into a PhD program, this program will be fully funded by the US institution. But on the other hand side, when we look at the research programs, and lots of times an emphasis is put on a researcher that has a concrete proposal of a topic that they want to research or do a teaching experience in the US. One of the first programs that I will talk about is a Fulbright Visiting Scholar program. And the reason that this program is very popular amongst the scholar community is its flexibility. We know that we are talking about a cohort that has a very specific ideas in their mind, a very specific research methodology that they want to use throughout this process, and a specific institution in mind that they would like to do conduct this research at. So from this perspective, Fulbright Visiting Scholar Program offers Georgian scholars to pursue a research or a teaching project at an American university or an institution. We realize that a lots of times there, especially in the STEM direction, there might be a research topic that would be well conducted, not only at an academic level, but at an organization that might not be a university. It might be an NGO or a think tank or an organization that specializes in a particular direction. So STEM research has been a key direction, to be honest, for this program. And we've seen projects conducted starting from physics, going into computer science. These projects are normally conducted from 3 months to 6 months. Ideally, a candidate that applies to this program is willing to spend whole 6 months in the US, but we understand that there are lots of commitments that the university professors have taken in Georgia. So from that perspective, this program will allow you to use the time based on your schedule. So this program does not really have a set timeline. So as soon as you are chosen for this program, you choose your own dates. You choose your dates to conduct this research, and it can be a conjunction. It can be either just a research project, it can be a teaching project, or it can be both. So there are lots of times when we have university professors here in Georgia that want to use this opportunity to take their experience, bring it to the US, and put it in the teaching process. And this is absolutely acceptable for us as well. When we talk about an ideal situation, ideal candidates would do both. They would partially conduct a research and partially do a teaching project. I want to share a screen and actually show you a web page where all this information can be found. It's on the US Embassy webpage under Education and Culture. And when we talk about an application process for this particular program, everything's conducted by our partner organization called Institute of International Education. So if you click on this link, it will take you to a portal where you will need to register your application. And it's a quite simple and straightforward process. The documents that will be required for this program are, if you are conducting a research project, it's definitely a project statement that would include a clear research methodology, your academic CV, 3 letters of recommendation, ideally all three of them would be academic. Also, if you are conducting a research, bibliography would be needed. If you are conducting a teaching grant, if you're under a teaching grant, then definitely you will need to upload a course syllabi. And it does not really, a lot of times we encountered that people that are conducting a joint research and teaching grant are under this grant. They mostly do kind of master classes that are aimed at all levels. It can be from BA to PhD students. So a sample syllabi would be definitely enough. Also, and this is where the flexibility part comes in. Since you are a person that will choose a host institution, we would like to see a letter of invitation. And it does not really have to be a super sophisticated document. It can be just a simple 2 paragraphs stating that this institution is ready to host you and what kind of outcomes you are looking at potentially to be listed in this document as well. It can be simply just bullet points. Also, this program has a limitation that it requires an applicant to have a PhD degree received from a Georgian university, or alternatively, it can be a master's degree from either a European or a US institution. This is this competition is normally announced in October and deadline is in November. So you have a 1 month's time to complete the whole application. And the next stage for this process is an interview, next and last stage. So interview with a reviewing committee, which is composed of people that are familiar with the most of the fields that will be providing applications. So these vary from starting from agriculture, going into urban planning, but most of the STEM fields are definitely included in this program. And definitely this is one of the flagship programs that the embassy would be offering to these scholars. I'll kindly, I don't want to take too much time. I'll slowly move to another program, which is another Fulbright program. But if you have any questions, please feel free to stop me at any point, either write a question in the chat box or just please feel free to unmute your microphone and then we can take it from there. Fulbright programs, there are several of them that we implement in Georgia. The most popular one is meant for the master's degree programs, and this program substituted a very famous MASCI program that was run in Georgia for a master's level degree programs, and it's one of the only programs that offers full scholarship to the master's degree programs. But also lately, and we sent a last cohort in 2012, but last year Georgia was added to a list of countries that has an opportunity to be part of Fulbright faculty development program. So some similarities and some differences with the Fulbright visiting scholar. For the faculty development program is actually meant for a younger faculty members, people that either have just started teaching at a university or planning to expand the area and topics that they are teaching at the university. So the main goal for this program is actually to focus on curriculum development, which has been one of the key priorities for the Ministry of Education in Georgia. We know that Georgia is part of the internationalization process, and with Bologna process, we've seen that mobility tracks are allowing Georgian students to actually pursue their even bachelor degree education at a European university and easily transferring the credits. So from that perspective, adding this program to the chain of the Fulbright programs in Georgia, the idea was to actually help Georgian government to actually reach these goals And when it comes to curriculum development, this program will allow Georgian scholars that will go under this program to actually collaborate with other professors from not only from this region, but from the US as well. So this program actually will choose a host institution for a grantee, so for an individual that will become a finalist. So from that perspective, everything starts in New York and finishes in New York. So you have a pre and post orientation program where the scholars are working on different types of both on course syllabi and a curriculum. So by the end of this program, participants are expected to come up with 2 different course syllabi. So that is an end result, that tangible results that the program coordinators would be looking for. But for this program, it does not really require for a person to have a PhD. A simple master's degree would be enough. One of the key questions that lots of times we get is, what does it mean to be eligible for J1 visa? So J1 visa actually is a visa that is issued to all exchange program participants, and it has a 2 years of mandatory stay in Georgia as a requirement. And there are lots of misconceptions about this as well. And I want to clarify that people that return back to Georgia, they are expected to stay in the country, but they can still apply for a tourist visa. They can still travel easily abroad, go to the US, go to Europe, but they cannot officially migrate there. So that's a restriction that is laid out by the Department of State, and especially on these programs. And I should mention that the design of these programs is created by the Bureau of Educational Cultural Affairs, and the abbreviation is ECA. That is a bureau that we directly fall under and work with on these programs. So to move on with the format of this program, one of the additional requirements that we received from the ECA is that because we have to enroll applicants to a university, these people will have to receive a TOEFL test. So if you already have a TOEFL test that is valid for 2 years and that the expiration date has not passed, then that's a simple yes, you can definitely use that TOEFL test. But if you don't have one, we will provide you a voucher that will cover the cost of the test. And based on this test and the score, we will be able, with the IEIE, Institute of International Education, to place you at a host institution. One of the interesting parts, and I think the perks of this program, is what can be offered at this university. So when we talk about the agreement that will be signed between you and this university, there are different sorts of additional opportunities that you might receive beyond curriculum development. This can be a permission to observe a class. And I think when it comes to scholars, this is a useful part where you actually can see what's happening at a US class for a particular subject. Another one is actually access to appropriate laboratories. When it comes to STEM education, for us, that's definitely a priority. Also, access to a computer facilities for you to conduct your research on, or work on your curriculum development. Also, access to health services, access to different types of facilities that are offered at this university, borrowing privileges at university libraries, office space, shared workspace, a university ID, and on-campus housing, or off-campus housing help. So all of these are based on an institution that you will be placed at. With this program, last year we selected 2 participants that were supposed to travel, but unfortunately due to COVID, it is postponed. So this year, they also, my colleague Thea and Chris, they also conducted a competition. So we also have 2 additional winners, but hopefully they will be able to travel together. Similarly, this is implemented by IEIE, so it's the application process is very similar to the one where Fulbright visiting scholars are filling out. Only part that is missing is a proposal that you have to upload. For this particular program, as I told you, first step is an application, second step is an interview, and shortlisted candidates are invited, and the third step is a TOEFL test. And based on that, you will receive a university placement. This program also, it's quite new because a lot of time has passed since 2012. So we are not really sure, and I'm being very honest with you, what tangible results we will be receiving once these people arrive back to Georgia. But from us, the idea is to actually support universities in Georgia in the respective fields that these people represent, and to actually help the curriculum development and internationalization process. And that's actually one of the key ideas behind both of these projects, but mainly for the Fulbright Faculty Development Program, because it's actually written in the name as well. Also, one thing that I should mention is that all of these programs are fully funded. And when we talk about fully funding, we talk about tuition fees, we talk about lodging, we talk about travel costs, both international and internal. And also these programs actually, the grant is laid out in a way that if you are in the US and you see a particular opportunity that is outside of a state that you might be, you can still ask for additional funding and pursue that opportunity as well. So from that perspective, Fulbright programs are definitely flexible in a way that they allow participants to use the maximum of the opportunities that they see in front of them. And lots of times you will be working with an advisor. So the Institute of International Education that works on most of our exchange programs, especially under Fulbright and Humphrey category, they are the people that actually have the great knowledge of the field, and they can support you throughout these processes. From this, I would actually like to move on a program that has a bit more of a cultural aspect to it. A lot of times I know that amongst the scholar community, the cultural exchange part is not the most desired because you have a very limited of time that you can spend abroad. So from that perspective, I still would like to highlight this. It has a list of subject areas that people can apply. A few of them fall under STEM category, but not most of them. But still, I would like to mention this opportunity. Maybe it might be useful for you and for your colleagues. So it's actually a chain of programs that is called Study of the United States Institute, SUSI. It's the abbreviation. It's offered to scholars. It's offered to actually secondary school educators and also university students. So this program is meant for a month-long period of time, and it's implemented at a particular host institution that is chosen based on a topic. So topics are American culture and values, journalism and media, religious freedom and pluralism, US economics and business, US foreign policy, and also youth workforce development and closing the skills gap. So this program is designed in a way that the portion of the program is spent in a classroom environment with workshops and master classes conducted on these topics that are highlighted and listed here. But the portion of this program is actually dedicated to cultural exchange, which means that the amount of these people that will be selected for this program from the whole region, and this region includes Romania, Bulgaria, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and lots of Middle Eastern countries that are presented from that region, and the double amount of the second and the same amount of the cohort would be US scholars. So you have an opportunity to actually share your experience with your colleagues that represent these particular fields. Application is very, very simple. You have to just download this Word document, which lists certain areas that you have to highlight. It just, you have to answer the questions like the subject areas that you teach, the level of education that you're providing. Is it a BA, MA, PhD? Also, a number of students that you supervise throughout the year, and number of hours that you are dedicating to either teaching or supervision. And based on this information, you will provide a simple essay about your idea of an outcome that you want to receive from this program. And based on that, shortlisted candidates go through the interview process, and then they are traveling to the US during summer. Most of the time, the deadline for this program is announced during winter holidays in Georgia. So it's close to 15th of July, and the selected candidates are traveling to the US in summer at around June or July. So they spend 1 month at a host institution there. This program, as I told you, it has both academic and cultural aspects to it. So that's the kind of a main idea, is to actually bring the best practices to Georgia in these subject areas, and also bring the flavor and flair of US culture to these programs, to this and teaching methodologies. Lastly, the last program that I will mention is actually not meant for Georgian scholars, but it can be an interesting opportunity for you to bring your US counterpart, your US colleagues to Georgia. It's called Fulbright US Visiting Scholar Program. And we have it for both scholars and research students. And this allows this allows US scholars to come to Georgia, choose a particular host institution, teach a class, and also conduct a research, similar to the one that is offered to Georgian scholars under the Fulbright Visiting Scholar category. In this regard, we have seen collaborations that work on conflict management, that work on per se STEM education, and particularly focusing on STEM education for young women in Georgia. And going to the regions, lots of times we see that most of these Fulbright scholars that come from the US prefer to be placed in Tbilisi, but we also highlight that for an embassy, for us a priority also would be to actually take their experience and per se take it to other regional universities like in Akhaltsikhe or in Batumi or in Tel Aviv, Zugdidi also, Gori. So it's a great opportunity, but as well, it does not really depend on a Georgian scholar. This US scholar, you can recommend this program to them, but they will have to definitely by themselves apply and go through a selection process in the US. But this also is an opportunity that can be useful, and we've seen some great examples that have emerged. Especially last year, we had a cohort where we had a particular scholar placed at the Ilia State University that worked on early childhood development, that has brought her PhD students to conduct a research in Georgia, and they came up with a particular methodology that will be implemented by Ilia State University in this regard. And it was actually really interesting to see what was happening from that perspective. We also had a scholar that was placed at Tbilisi State University that worked on conflict management and is actually specializing in South Ossetian side that brought some interesting insights to the latest developments that are happening in this regard. So from my perspective, what I can say is that the number of programs that are offered to Georgian scholars is a bit limited to compare to other age groups, but I think with the flexibility that is given from a Fulbright visiting scholar, it's a great opportunity to actually tailor the whole program to your needs. For a Fulbright faculty development program, if you think that curriculum development is something that can be useful for you as a professional or for your university, definitely this would be a great program to apply to. Also, if you are more interested in having both academic and cultural aspects to your exchange visit, and you are looking for a short-term program, definitely the study of the US Summer Institute program would be a great opportunity. And beyond that, the embassy definitely is supporting the STEM education through different types of grant opportunities that are offered to organizations. Our section, public affairs section, is working on different types of grant projects, which can be easily found under embassy grants. And two of them that I would like to mention that could be interesting for you are the newest grant program that the embassy has added is called Education and Culture Culture and Education Small Grants Program, which offers different types of institutions and individuals to apply and receive up to 15,000 USD to conduct a project that has an either layer of an educational aspect or a layer of a cultural aspect. And it actually, the idea and the scope that it's written from is bringing Georgian and US cultures together. So any ideas that you might have that you think is interesting for 24,000, I'm sorry, from 5,000 to 24,000. And it's on rolling basis. It has 2 deadlines. Another opportunity that is actually widely used by university. And this year we had last year 2 winners, 3 Georgian universities: Business and Technology University, Tbilisi State University, and Ilia State University, that received Democracy Small Grants Program and Democracy Commission Small Grants Program, which is meant for grant opportunities that go close to 50,000 USD per project. And as I told you, one of the programs last year was about STEM education and actually making it more accessible, widely reachable for women and especially young girls in Georgia, and covering all sorts of regions that we have not only ethnic but religious minorities as well. And this was an area. It is quite broad. It actually follows the line of the U.S. Embassy's mission goals. So you will see topics like women empowerment, inclusion, civic integration, different types of human rights, and that's actually my area of expertise. I specialize in educational projects, but for vulnerable population. So that those were kind of in the area that I was especially interested in, seeing different types of projects that were implemented in Georgia. But definitely these are grant opportunities that I think can be interesting for a scholar and especially for a university that they represent. And also if you participate in a US government funded exchange program, and if you become an alumni, we have also the way, and the embassy is actually really proud of this community. We have close to 6,000 US government funded exchange program alumni going back to 1993. And this program is called Alumni Grants Program, and it also allows alumni to apply for programs up to 15,000 USD. I think I'll stop here. I've talked a lot, but if you have any questions, I'll be here throughout the session. I'll make sure that I drop links to all of these programs in your chat box, and also separately provide Anna with this information so she can share it with you. But to be honest, the main resource from this perspective would be a US Embassy webpage. I'll also write my personal email address if you'll ever have any questions that's relating to either educational or cultural programs. Please feel free to reach out. As you will see from this presentation, it's that we have certain limitations as an embassy when it comes to funding, when it comes to different types of projects. We, as a mission, US mission in Georgia also includes USAID, which is more flexible in that regard. So a lot of times they would be working on projects that are definitely on a larger scale, that covers several millions, and that's invested primarily in developing different types of sectors, and education is definitely one of them. So if you'll ever need a referral or a contact information from that perspective as well, I would be delighted to help. But definitely, I want to, from the bottom of my heart, wish you the best of luck. I think programs like this really matter, and STEM education is a direction that, as a country, we definitely have to really focus on, even though we've seen lots of developments that have been kind of like scattered around in Georgia, and lots of times that's the reality that we are facing, that lots of reforms are in this regard. But I think Magda and her team, and with the MCC Millennium Challenge account that was in Georgia, have done a tremendous work in actually bringing a certain type of synergy and complementarity to the projects that were implemented. And we are definitely delighted to see extremely good results that came out of this project. So this is something that I think as an embassy, they will definitely continue providing support. And as people that are on a working level, working with these programs, we can continue to definitely put our best foot forward and work on the projects that can be mutually beneficial. So thanks a lot for actually giving me some time. And definitely, if you have any questions, please feel free to ask. I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I think you did a really nice job in a short period of time of covering the various programs. To the participants, if you put your questions for either speaker in the chat, we'll either get them answered during the presentation, at the end of the presentations today, or we'll post answers, but all questions will be answered. Also, this is being recorded, and you'll be able to review this and the other mini course lectures from the recorded videos. So any links that are shown in the presentation, you'll be able to view from the recorded presentations. We have a little bit of time. Are you going to be able to stay with us till the end, or will you have to go correctly?
No, definitely I'm able to stay. And what I'll do is I see all the questions in the chat box, and I'll individually answer them. If we have time, I can because some people had questions about undergraduate and master's level degree programs. I can easily, quickly, it will just take me 5 minutes to mention the areas that we focus on from our exchange programs, and then definitely I'll individually answer the questions. So when it comes to the undergraduate level education, the program that we offer, the undergraduate global UGRAD program, I have to mention that it's a non-degree. It's a 1 semester long exchange program that offers every field student to apply and spend an academic semester, either fall or the autumn semester in the US, and actually take courses that might not be able, they might not be able to take in Georgia. So from that perspective, this program is actually very popular. So this year we had close to 300 applications that we had to review, and lots of them are STEM field related, and lots of times we see San Diego State University as people that apply from this university. So definitely Global UGRAD is one of the programs. When it comes to the master's level degree programs, as I told you, Fulbright graduate student program is the one in Georgia that offers full scholarship to pursue a master's level degree education in the US. One misconception that lots of times people have is that they can choose a university, even though that in the application you will be able to list your preferences. That does not mean that IIE will guarantee that the placement will happen exactly at a university that you have chosen. So that is something that we have to be actually very clear because a lots of times placements, I'm being very honest with you, depend on scores that you will receive on your TOEFL test, on your GRE or the GMAT, also your GPA and the academic credentials that you bring to the table, also activities and the study plan that you are offering to this particular university. So we actually have a flexibility to actually try to place the student as many universities as possible, gather as many actually internal scholarships as possible, and offer a best fit. So we have actually specialists that are trained to do analysis of a particular application and choose the best fit university. So that's on a master's level degree programs. And also when it comes to professional development, I should mention that under a Fulbright program umbrella falls a Humphrey Fellowship program, and that can be easily used by scholars as well. It's a mid-career, it's meant for a mid-career level professionals, people that have from at least 5 years of working experience in a particular field. And they can actually spend 1 year in the US doing a master's level degree courses, but also doing a work experience. So it has a placement at an organization where you will actually be able to directly work and spend your time there. So these are kind of a range of programs. And also there are programs that are meant for professionals that are on a nomination basis. So these are international visitors exchange program and open world program. So we've actually sent a lots of Georgian educational specialists, and I personally work with groups that focused on higher education policy and also civic education that was meant for teachers and university representatives. And from that perspective, we closely collaborate with the Ministry of Education that has laid out a comprehensive plan of what they see is a future for Georgian education, and we also find the ways how we can be part of that. And for a USAID, primary education has been a focus because we've seen a decline in scores that Georgian students are receiving in mathematics and reading comprehension. So for them, that has been an area that they focused on a lot. For us, mainly when it comes to educational projects, the budget is laid out in a way that it's fully invested in exchange programs and programs that are implemented in conjunction with US scholars coming to Georgia. And one thing that I forgot to mention is that we also have a Fulbright Specialist program that if a university and if your university sees a particular need, we can request a specialist to come to Georgia for a short period of time. It can be up to 4 weeks. It can be up to a month, where this person will either come and help you with a particular curriculum or will do definitely different types of teaching. So let me put that link under our chat so you can take a look at it. normally it's on rolling basis. You can apply for the program throughout the year, but if you decide to apply to that program, please reach out to me, because we have a certain type of like budget amount. If that budget amount is spent, I will let you know. So you are not actually investing too much of your time and resources in a program that has already maximized its cap. So that's kind of a last thing that I wanted to mention. But otherwise, I'll follow the chat box and answer all the questions that will come. Thank you.
Great, thanks again. Really appreciate that. That's an exciting slate of offerings. Good to hear. Our next speaker is distinguished Professor Sandy Bernstein from San Diego State University. He has a long, illustrious career in research, particularly in studying gene-controlled muscles with Drosophila as a model system. As I mentioned, he's distinguished professor, which is a select group of outstanding researchers at San Diego State. And as I mentioned earlier, he's been doing training under NIH funding including in responsible conduct of research. Ethics and proper protocol is becoming increasingly an issue and increasingly important in the US and worldwide. And so this is an extremely important topic, and it's extremely important to understand what is acceptable process and what is not. So with that, I will let Dr. Bernstein take over. Sandy.
Thank you, Dr. Rochelle. It's a pleasure to be here today. I hope you can hear me okay and see me okay. I'm on campus at San Diego State, which I haven't done very much during this very bleak pandemic period, but we hope that things will be changing soon and we'll start having face-to-face classes and so forth. I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you. As Walt said, I've been teaching a course actually in bioethics at the graduate level for a number of years here. And while I bring in a lot of outside speakers, I'm the one that covers the area of responsible conduct of research. So I've kind of rejigged that material and tried to include some examples from Europe and Asia to give you more of a worldwide flair for it. But it will focus mostly on the US rules and regulations, but they are applicable worldwide to a large extent. And many of you obviously are interested in US science and policies. So let's hope that that is something that's relevant for you. So let me put my slides up. Hope you're seeing that now. And here's our campus. You've probably seen that logo, and it's about that empty at this moment. Not too many people walking around, but let's hope that that will change. Okay, so here's an overview of what I'll be discussing this morning or evening, depending on where you are. Talk about rigor and reproducibility in science. It's become a very important catchphrase for the National Institutes of Health in the US at this point. The importance of accurate record keeping and methods for doing that. Then I'll segue into talking about authorship of scientific papers, which all of these issues can be somewhat controversial. And if you've co-authored a paper, perhaps you know that that indeed can be a controversial topic. Who goes first? Who's the lead author? Who's the senior author, et cetera. What about ownership of scientific data? I'll be talking about that in terms of commercialization of material that you may be an inventor on. So that's important to consider as well. Again, a new emphasis is data availability. In the computer age, of course, we can put all of our data into archives that are publicly available, and more journals and grant proposal reviews require that data be available. Then we'll talk a little bit about citation ethics, both in manuscripts and in grant applications. When is it important to cite other people's ideas and acknowledge that perhaps you weren't the author of a particular idea? We'll talk briefly about conflicts of interest, mostly in terms of how financial conflicts of interest can occur and perhaps how they can be mitigated. And then we'll get into 3 areas that are very important for all students, faculty, scientists, and engineers in general: plagiarism, or copying of other people's work, falsification or fabrication of scientific data. Okay, that is changing the data or actually making up the data. So I'm not trying to tell you how to do these things. I'm trying to tell you how to avoid doing these things, right? Okay, but we will give some clear examples of this having occurred in the past. So to start with reproducibility and rigor, a lot of this emphasis stems back to some studies where people have tried to reproduce in a repetitive way multiple experimental procedures that have been published already, accepted journal articles and so forth. Okay, so this has occurred in a number of different areas. For instance, a psychology study called the Reproducibility Project tried to replicate the effects of 100 different psychology studies. Well, you would think that maybe some of them didn't work out as originally published, but 97% of the original studies produced statistically significant results, but only 36% of the replication studies did so. So does that mean that the authors of the original studies were trying to fabricate data, et cetera? Not necessarily. There are a number of reasons why the data were not replicable. And it could also be that the materials and methods weren't really talked about in enough detail to allow replication. Now, it's psychology. You may say, well, that is a science where there's a lot of interpretation of results and so forth. So what about other areas like medicine or behavioral economics? Well, studies were done there as well. And in the medical area, only 25% of data were replicated and 61% in behavioral economics. Okay, so science in general, as talked about in this article, is reckoning with challenges in one of its basic tenets, that is replication. Okay. So the National Institutes of Health at the US has really, over the last 5 years or so, decided that rigor and reproducibility is very important. Obviously, as it's said in the last slide, it's a basic tenet of science. So how do we decide whether a project has adequate rigor and reproducibility? And this is something, for instance, when I serve on a grant review panel for the NIH, they tell you you need to assess whether the proposed work is going to be rigorous and reproducible. Okay, so we start off with a sound premise for the research. That is, if you're proposing to do research based on something that was previously done, and that's certainly typically the case, was that previous research sound? Okay, if it was poorly done, then your whole hypothesis and reason for doing the work may not be rigorous. Then once you design your own experiments, have you validated the design? Okay, are your experimental approaches, controls, etc., appropriate? Okay, and much of that can be done using appropriate statistical tests. And this has become more and more important as the years go on. And individuals with statistical expertise often have to be consulted in order to discuss your results, determine whether it falls within the believable category, reaches the standards of statistical significance. Okay. More and more data have to be available to reviewers and editors. Okay, in the old days, people would have their lab notebooks shelved away in the lab, and they would publish their papers. And if someone said, well, where's the data? You'd say, it's all in the paper, right? But typically not all the data, at least the raw data, are in the paper. Okay. And more of the particularly high profile journals are requiring that the raw data be available for the reviewers and the editors so they could assess whether you interpreted it correctly. Okay. This next one sounds perhaps a little strange: image manipulation limits. One would think that when you're looking at images, then you should not manipulate them whatsoever. However, it is appropriate to, in quotes, manipulate things if you need to improve the resolution, if you need to increase the brightness on a microscope field, etc., as long as you do the same thing for all the data. In other words, you're not going to highlight one particular area where you think you see an antibody binding, make that brighter and make everything else dark. That would be inappropriate. Okay, and there are interestingly, both computer programs that can assess image manipulation, and then there are some specialists. You can look through the recent literature, like in the Scientist journal or Science or Nature, and you'll see that there are some people that sort of make a hobby of going through published papers and trying to find manipulated or duplicated images. Another possibility, important, is to do blinded studies to prevent bias. What we mean by blinded studies is that you have your samples coded so that you don't know if it's the experimental or the control that you're working with. And you do the study, you know, it's sort of like a placebo test in the medical world. You do the study, and then you break the blinded aspect of it and interpret the data from there. Okay, so if you're testing how well fruit flies fly, like we do in my lab, presumably you should call them A and B, not experimental and control, and do the study without knowing which one is which, and then break the code. And then finally, particularly in the cell molecular area, but I'm sure this is true in other areas as well, verification of your starting material. Some of you may have heard of the issue with HeLa cells, which are tissue culture cells derived from a tumor back in the early 50s. And they are very prolific in how well they grow. Okay, which was great because it was really the first continuous cell line. It's very sad for the woman, obviously, that died as a result of the tumor, but she made an amazing contribution to science, including medicine. In any case, these cells are so prolific and invasive that many of these other cell lines in various labs that also co-culture HeLa cells, those cell lines have been overgrown by the HeLa cells. And people are doing studies on this so-called other type of cell, a kidney cell or a different tumor, et cetera. They're doing all their studies, making conclusions, publishing papers. And it turned out that when an assessment was done across many, many labs, it found out they actually did their study on HeLa cells, not what they thought they were working on. So validating that the cell lines are correct. Similarly with antibodies. If an antibody binds to a particular protein, well, you either have to take somebody's word for it or show directly that it does bind. There have been studies, again, where individuals have used an antibody that they thought bound to one protein, but really bound to different one or multiple ones, and made incorrect conclusions. And finally, transgenic organisms, when you're mutating a gene or putting in a foreign gene into an organism, you need to check that the gene actually got in. If you're getting it from a different investigator, you should check that indeed it's the transgenic organism you think it is. Okay. So the DFG in Germany also talked about reproducibility of results in medical and biomedical research. And what are some of the reasons that this is occurring? Okay, why are people failing to adhere to appropriate rigor and reproducibility? Well, in some cases, there may be legal and ethical regulations for reproducing studies. For instance, if there are animal regulations where you try to limit the number of animals that you're going to use, then doing another whole study to reproduce the original study seems to be ethically difficult to justify. Okay. What about storage of research data and materials? If there's not a suitable infrastructure available to store on a long-term basis, if you stored all your data on floppy disks in 1985, well, you might not find a computer that can read it these days. So that's another problem, storage of research data and materials, such as organisms or tissue samples, etc. And then this last one is fairly complicated, that when people try to publish papers, they typically want to have an exciting result to discuss, not a negative result, i.e., well, we had a hypothesis and it turned out to not be true. Well, why don't you want to publish that? Sometimes that's very important. Well, it's not as exciting. You won't get a press release out of it, most likely. You won't necessarily get grant funding. You might not be, you might not be promoted at your faculty job. You might not get your thesis accepted, etc. So the DFG at least felt that that's a misguided incentive system, that sometimes people are trying to make positive findings that are not really positive, so they're calling them false positive findings because they're more attractive and will allow them to get publications and grant funding. Okay, so what did they suggest in terms of solutions at the DFG? Well, for animal welfare people, for funders of grants, to be more generous if they have the money and support replication studies to redo experiments and show that the data, the conclusions were correct. Ask research institutions to train people better in terms of data storage and provide systems for storage of the data and accessibility of the data. Okay. Then get the journals to publish replication studies. Not very exciting to just redo somebody else's work and then publish the paper that says, yes, it was correct. But in terms of scientific integrity, it is an important issue. Okay. A lot of the journals have now developed checklists for scientific integrity. When you submit a paper, you have to read through each of these areas, statistics, data acquisition, et cetera, and sign that you have kept the integrity appropriate for these issues. Okay. Granting agencies, well, when a grant application comes in, often the reviewers will assess how well the applicant has published in the past. Well, if publication output is really important, then people may not be as careful about doing their experiments appropriately. They'd rather get the papers out more quickly. So suggestion is the granting agency shouldn't be so picky about how many publications an individual has had. And then there's another issue with scientific journals. As many of you know, you want to read a new paper and you go online to read it, and you cannot get to read it because your library doesn't subscribe to that journal. Maybe if you're lucky, 6 months or a year later, it'll be available. So that's called a paywall. You can purchase it for usually a fairly expensive cost, or maybe through your university library. But that really does impede the scientific communication. So this is an area of great concern to scientists, librarians, and of course, journal publishers, as well as scientific societies, about making journals available to the scientific individuals as well as the public rapidly. Some of this is being taken over by the allowance of publication of pre-manuscripts. In other words, people are putting their manuscripts online on particular sites prior to peer review. So that has the advantage that it gets the data out very quickly, but it has the disadvantage of it hasn't been peer reviewed, and maybe the data won't stand up through peer review. And this has been exacerbated during the pandemic, where many studies have appeared on these open sites that are subject to peer review and may be great, but may be lacking in terms of scientific integrity. So let's talk about record keeping. There's what was available when I started graduate school, and we still pretty much use these laboratory notebooks for data collection and storage. But maybe it's a good idea to have some sort of backup. What if you lose your book, it's stolen, the lab catches fire? So computer backup, photocopy, photographs, include some details in your lab notebook. I can't tell you how many I've seen over the years where, they'll just be labeled samples 1 through 12 and no experimental detail of what they refer to and the interpretation as well. So it's really important so that someone else can look at your notebook and understand what it's about. And what I said there about sign off, I'm thinking about inventions and potential patents, that it's sometimes important if you're moving in that direction that you have someone else witness that you made an experimental observation on a particular date. So you certainly should also date your lab notebook. So the personal computer has taken over the lab notebook to a large degree. But again, you need to have backup, keep it in the cloud. Then there's the access issues, outdated files, issues with security and so forth. So those things need to be considered. We've experimented with this Lab Guru electronic notebook in my lab. There are quite a number of them I've listed over there, and many more that are available. They're useful in the sense that, for instance, anyone in the lab that you give permission to can look at your notebook, like your PI can go in and look at the data anywhere, as long as they have their password. But then, of course, one worries about whether the company is backing up appropriately and so forth. And so you should probably download PDF versions of each of these, of your experiments to store elsewhere. And recently, for instance, at SDSU, we've joined this Globus system that allows data transfer, data protection, data sharing, and cloud storage. So that's sort of a centralized data storage system. And I haven't tried it out, but it's particularly useful when you're doing huge projects like population studies or collecting DNA sequences, etc. And you want to share it with your collaborators, for instance. So let's talk a little bit about authorship. So you've collected your data, you've stored your data appropriately, you've designed your experiments appropriately, it's time to write it up. And who should be an author on your paper? Well, it turns out there are different thoughts about this in different parts of the world, but give you the general US perspective. So the person needs to play an important role in design and execution of an important part of the work. That's one possibility. Another is analysis of the data. A third is interpreting the results, which is pretty similar to data analysis. And the fourth would be preparation of the manuscript. Okay, now many of the journals are now requiring that you actually list the roles of each of the authors. So that's when it gets a little bit dicey, as you'll see in the next slide, which is when is a person not an author? Okay. If they provided funding but not play another major role in the project. Okay, now you're going to get arguments about each of these, and there are different traditions in different countries. Okay, but at least Stanley Malloy, one of our associate VP, thought this was important enough to point out. If the individual was a group leader but did not play another major role in the project. Now, there has been a long tradition in Europe where there would be a group leader, at least in the biomedical area, who would have a series of professors that would work in that department. And typically, and this is carried over to a number of places like Scripps Institute and so forth in San Diego, any of those professors would publish a paper and would include the group leader as an author on the paper, even if they didn't play any role. So here we're suggesting that that person should be acknowledged, not be a co-author. If they provide space or instruments for the project, okay, if you let me use your spectrophotometer, I'll make you a co-author in my paper. Well, that person really didn't have any experimental role in design of the project or interpreting the results, so it's not really appropriate. Again, another area that's what I call dicey, technical assistance, okay? An individual you're paying usually that does some of the technical work. I draw the line, for instance, if they do interpretation of the data as well, then certainly they should be an author. If they're just sectioning samples and handing them to you, well, maybe not. Okay. If they perform services for a fee, okay, you send your sample out to a private lab, pay them a fee, and they analyze the sample, return the data, they're not going to be a collaborator on the authorship. Okay. Right, so these people should be acknowledged in the manuscript. There's a nice area, usually at the end of the manuscript, where it says acknowledgements, and you can acknowledge these individuals. But as I said, there are different interpretations of this information in different labs, in different countries, and you have to be cognizant of what is appropriate. And it is really can be very difficult in terms of deciding who is appropriate as an author. And it's something that's better discussed early on in the project rather than at the end. Okay. Now, if we settled on who the authors are, what is the appropriate order in the paper? And it's actually different in different fields. So in my field, the principal investigator would be the last author on the paper. Okay. And if there were other collaborator principal investigators, they'd be next to last and next to last. And the individuals that did the bulk of the experimental work would be toward the beginning. But in other areas, that person might be a first author, or in some areas may not be an author at all. I know ecology students here who might design their own experiment, bounce it off their advisor, but carry it out fairly independently, and the advisor is just acknowledged, not a co-author on the paper. Okay. Some journals put your authorship alphabetically. So oftentimes people will have their curriculum vitae, if their field does this or a particular journal does this, and they'll have a little asterisk that says alphabetical listing of authors, because if your last name begins with Z, then you're probably going to be last author on all the papers. The amount of contribution, typically the first author is the main person that has done the majority of the work that's present. But as the years have gone on, it becomes a little more difficult to interpret. Now we have co-first authors in many areas where you'll have an asterisk next to the second author and the first saying these individuals contributed equally to this work. I've seen 3 first authors as well, 3 asterisks. But in the end, of course, they'll say, when the paper is referenced, most likely it's just going to be the first author et al. So even amongst equals, the first author tends to stand out. Now, this is an unusual term. Actually, I'm not sure where it came from, called salami slicing. I guess it means because you can cut thinner and thinner slices of a salami, and maybe you can cut thinner and thinner slices of your paper and divide it into multiple articles, okay? Well, you know, there are some advantages to that because you are producing more than one paper, so that's nice. You are acknowledging author A in the first paper as the first author and author B as the first author in the second paper, so they both get their credit. But the negative aspect is that the article may not, each of them may not stand on their own as solid contributions. And if they were combined, it really would be an outstanding paper. Separately, they're kind of weaker. Okay, so that's the plus and minus of so-called salami slicing. Okay, so what about scientific data ownership? In the US, the universities actually own the scientific data. This is because typically it's grant funded, and the grants are actually made to the university, not to the individual faculty member or investigator. Okay. But the university will typically designate to the principal investigator the ownership or the partial ownership of the data. Okay. And this is what we call intellectual property. You know, it's not actual physical property, but the experimental design and results and applications are then typically shared by the university and the investigator. Well, why does this matter? It matters because there could be money involved, right? If the university decides to patent it, the process or the product, it's possible that the material could be licensed to users and make money for the university or the faculty member or even the students or postdocs that worked on the project. Okay. Now, this sounds great, but the vast majority of experimental results that are patented do not lead to profit in the public sector, but occasionally it does. So in terms of patenting, the material must not have been disclosed previously. It must be novel. It must be useful. These are the US requirements, but they're pretty much worldwide. It must be non-obvious, okay? Not something that is an everyday thing. And it must be patentable subject matter. There are certain things that are not patentable, some natural products and so forth. So where do students and postdocs stand in this issue? Well, often they can be co-inventors on these patents, and perhaps they can be recipients of funding. For instance, at SDSU, we have a very nice 50-50 share between the inventor and the university. It's not as nice at some other institutions. So postdocs and students should be aware of this possibility and speak up for themselves if they feel that they're an inventor on a project. All right, so excuse me, this is from Nature, which is, as many of you know, is a top scientific journal. They now have a data availability statement, and it's fairly stringent, and they require that when you submit a paper for evaluation, you must provide the supporting data to the editors and the peer reviewers for evaluating the manuscript. Okay. The paper itself must indicate where the data set is available in order to interpret, replicate, and build upon the methods of the findings. Okay. So there's going to have to be some methodology. Presumably, you're not going to put thousands of lines of data collection into the paper itself. So there has to be some mechanism for providing that data for individuals that want to reproduce the data or build on it. Okay. So their preferred method is public repositories that are cared for, curated, and available. Okay. Another possibility, as you'll note if you read the literature, that a lot of papers now have supplementary information files that can contain all the data in spreadsheets and so forth. And that would be published online with your journal article. Okay. But for some data sets, it's mandatory that the data be submitted to a community endorsed repository. So for instance, the Protein Data Bank, or various nucleic acid sequence banks and so forth. And I'm sure there are some in other areas as well. So you must submit your data and make it available to the community. So now we're going to get into some of the ethical issues. And what we'll end up talking about are some of the ethical dilemmas, as well as individuals who have gone beyond the pale in terms of fraudulent science. So that makes for interesting discussion, but very negative and blot onto the scientific community. Okay. So when you're writing a grant application or a publication or even a paper for your class, it's essential to cite previous publications, okay, in every aspect of the work. Okay, if there's background work, if you have overlapping results with another investigator, then you should cite the other investigators' results that have been published as well. If you're coming up with an idea or a model, then you should provide, and it's based on other people's ideas or models, you should cite them. Okay, and here's an example. I'm not sure how big your screen is, so I'll read this to you. in the ethics of citation, this particular fellow had seen a paper appear in a prestigious journal. It contained results that were nearly identical to his results published a year earlier. He read the paper and he found that it had concerned the same family proteins, the same species, same characteristics, and yet not a word of this individual's work was mentioned in the paper. Okay. They even reached similar conclusions. The paper was submitted 5 months after this fellow's paper appeared. And on top of that, one of the authors had been in contact with his lab on several occasions and even requested some of the research material. So there was no doubt whatsoever that when the paper was written, they knew about their work. So why wasn't it cited? Well, of course, you could say it wasn't cited because they didn't want the reviewers to know that a similar paper had already been published, and maybe that would take the shine off theirs. But of course, that is inappropriate. So this fellow went ahead and made a phone call to the author. And after a moment of awkwardness, he apologized and acknowledged that, yes, our work was indeed relevant. He told me he cited it in sections of the paper and sent it to the co-author who was in charge of writing the paper, and the co-author omitted it from the final draft. So he took some responsibility, but maintained it was really the other person's fault. So he emailed this other author and was told that their work was known, but they decided not to mention it because of space constraints, because that was pretty much her only reason. So he took it finally to the society member who transmitted the paper to the journal. And while the society member was sympathetic, he said, so I just, this thing happens all the time, so why don't you just forget about it and promote your own work? So the final comment is, that's saying like theft is rampant, so why call the police when my car disappears, just buy another one. So he was pretty upset, and with good reason. Okay, so when one omits other people's work, it looks poorly on yourself, and it certainly is negative to the person whose work was omitted. So let's talk a little bit about conflicts of interest. Mostly in terms of financial, but there are other areas as well. When an individual can gain financially from an experimental study getting a particular result, how do we prevent that individual from falsifying the data? Okay. Well, one possibility, most severe, would be just ban that individual from participating. But, well, you know, if somebody works at a biotech company and they own stock in the biotech company, shares of stock, and they're still going to work their hardest to get some good data and some good drugs produced, or kits to do molecular biology with, or whatever. So you don't really want to ban them from participating, because then there wouldn't be anyone at the company participating if they all have stock in the company. Okay. So really what is mostly done is that there's public disclosure of the conflict. Tell the review board that's looking over the human subjects committee. Tell the funding agencies. Reveal in the journal conflict of interest section. Tell subjects that are being medically treated with a drug that, yes, the individual that helped develop this drug will benefit if the results are positive. Presentations, journal articles, etc. The Declaration of Helsinki requires that research subjects be told of conflicts of interest. So clearly, you know, if you're getting a drug as a research subject, you should know that the investigator might benefit from a positive result. Another area is the source of funding can lead to conflicts of interest. So if, for instance, you've done a study that shows that tobacco smoke is not harmful, it probably would be helpful to say that you were sponsored by a major cigarette company to do the study. Maybe there was a conflict of interest there. So the source of funding is important. Of course, the science should be held to the same standard, and the reviewers should hold it to the same standard. Okay, so let's get into the nitty-gritty of what the US Public Health Service says is research misconduct and how it should be handled. It's defined by the National Institutes of Health as fabrication, falsification, or plagiarism in proposing, performing, or reviewing research, or in reporting research results. And we'll break it down. Each of those three areas, fabrication, falsification, plagiarism, they're pretty well agreed universally as being very serious scientific misconduct. But not error or honest differences of opinion, okay? So if there's an error in the data collection or data interpretation, that is not misconduct because it's not made on purpose to mislead other people. They should be corrected, of course, if possible. So what is fabrication? It's making up results and recording or reporting them. So the results are totally made up out of thin air. Okay, so here's an example. MIT professor sacked for fabricating data. Graphs in this data figure here showing results of cell sorting showed that cells were taken from 3 different mice, yet they gave very similar patterns. And so this researcher from MIT was fired for fabricating data. And that also resulted in analysis of earlier data published by the same researcher, wondering whether they had fabricated as well. Okay. I mean, the thing about these data fabrications is that probably only the most blatant ones are caught. People that just copy and paste figures or make them up and then reproduce them tend to get caught. But presumably there are others that masquerade and don't manage to get caught. Falsification, on the other hand, is manipulating research materials, equipment, or processes, or changing or omitting data or results so the research is not accurately represented. Okay, here's an example from the Journal of Clinical Investigation. Here's the gel of protein or DNA that was submitted in this little red circle. It shows a blank area. However, in the original that I guess the editors probably demanded, it's not a blank area. So clearly it was image manipulation, falsification of the data. Okay, and in the lingo in the US, that means cooking the results, as shown here. This individual is cooking his results literally, okay, but changing the results to suit your hypothesis. Now, plagiarism is a serious issue that many of you have dealt with in classes, I'm sure, hopefully in a positive way. Appropriation of another person's ideas, processes, results, or words without giving appropriate credit, including those obtained through confidential review of others' research proposals and manuscripts. So I can relate an example that I personally experienced. This was years ago, before we had email even. I was asked to review a grant by the National Science Foundation, which they mailed to me and I read. And I'm reading through it, and I come to a paragraph where I'm reading, and gosh, this really sounds familiar. You know, it was a technique called in situ hybridization, where the individual was proposing to section tissue from mice and hybridize it with labeled RNA, and briefly talked about the procedure. And the more I read it, the more familiar it was. And then I realized they had taken a paragraph out of my NSF grant, changed the word Drosophila to mouse, and put it into their NSF grant. So I did call yes, in those days we used the telephone, and I called the NSF person and explained that there was plagiarism here. They said they would investigate and notify the individual, but the individual would know that it was me that blew the whistle on them, because no one else would have picked this up. I said, that's fine. So they did, and they got back to me, and apparently what had happened was that this scientist had given my grant proposal to another, like a postdoc in their lab, and said, please, read this over and write up this technique based on this paragraph. And she didn't realize that that person copied the technique and just changed a few words. So obviously that person wasn't even supposed to share my grant proposal with anyone, but that was my story, and I don't think there were any repercussions necessarily. Okay, the other major federal granting agency for basic science in the US is the National Science Foundation. They have a very similar first statement on scientific misconduct: for fabrication, falsification, plagiarism, or other serious deviation from accepted practices in proposing, carrying out, or reporting results from activities funded by the NSF. But they also have a second one that's interesting and will lead into some of the other comments I'll make, which is retaliation of any kind against a person who reported or provided information about suspected or alleged misconduct and who has not acted in bad faith. So if you are the individual who, as we say, blew the whistle on the falsification, fabrication, or plagiarism, that's going to change your life to some extent, because you're going to have to prove these allegations, or at least discuss them. And you are subject potentially to retaliation by the individual who you accused. The NSF says that that would itself be scientific misconduct to retaliate. To bring it home to SDSU, or perhaps SDSU Georgia, formal work publicly misrepresented as original. So this is in the SDSU catalog. Any activity wherein one knowingly, directly resorts to the published or unpublished work of another in order to represent it as one's own. In oral, written, or crafted pieces, if one copies ideas word for word or by paraphrase, those ideas should be duly noted. So, undergraduates may not have been schooled, or even graduate students, that you can't just lift phrases from other papers word for word, even if you cite that other paper. If it's word for word, you have to put quotation marks. If it's citing the idea, you should put in a citation. Okay, now somebody is writing on my screen here. So do other people see that writing on the screen there?
Yeah.
Yeah, we see it. It's not that has happened before. I'm not sure what's happening, Sandy, but.
Well, let's hope it's not Zoom bombing. We'll just carry on. But if Iacob is on one of the participants, please don't use your mouse at this point, okay? For some reason it's appearing on the screen. Thank you. Okay, so here's another interesting and relatively new issue, self-plagiarism. I mean, it's new in the sense that it's newly discovered. Are you allowed to quote yourself in a publication? In other words, say you wrote this beautiful introduction to your experiment in a paper. Can you take that same beautiful introduction and use it in a second paper? And the general answer is no. Well, why? Why? You wrote it. You can, why can't you republish it? Well, one issue is that copyright might be held by the journal. That would prevent it from being republished. Another is that it's still something that was in the literature already and probably should be reworded to some extent. Well, what if you get to the methodology section of your paper and you're doing the exact same method in the exact same way? Why do you need to write it differently? Well, maybe you don't. It depends upon the journal. It depends upon the outlook of the editor. Some journals have developed a percentage of self-plagiarized material that can appear in a given paper. Okay. But you should be cautious about it because there are programs that check on plagiarism when papers are submitted. And even if they pull up your own papers, they might be upset about it. And you know, you may have different set of co-authors on each paper. Someone else may have contributed to that original writing. Basically, it's simpler to rewrite it. There's the automated detection of plagiarism, and that is a common phenomenon for all journal articles that are submitted. Because there are some, you know, as we'll get into a little bit later, there are some cases where individuals have published basically the same article multiple times in different journals, which is clearly an ethical issue. So if you want to look more into self-plagiarism, you can get the recording and look at those particular URLs or take a quick screenshot there. Okay. So what happens once there is falsification or fabrication of scientific data? What must be done? Well, typically in the university area, they must investigate, okay? So the individual that complains is called the complainant or the whistleblower. That individual, first of all, needs to make sure that they have a valid complaint. Secondly, they need to talk to a university official to make their complaint. The respondent is the subject of the allegations, and the university is required to make an inquiry, and the inquiry is perhaps informal, but that needs to be followed by a more detailed investigation if the inquiry says it's warranted. Okay. And there can be consequences to the respondent. Individuals can be banned from research grants, fired from their job, or perhaps less serious consequences, or even more serious, as you'll see in a case study I'll talk about in a few minutes. Okay. Then there's the issue of the whistleblower. It's possible they're making a false claim. And if so, should there be consequences to that individual? Was it just a mistake? Or maybe they didn't like the respondent and they just decided they were going to blow the whistle falsely and something should be done. Now, in the US, if there is an investigation, then we have to notify the granting agency if the inquiry occurs, if there's a health hazard involved. We'll talk about a case like that in a minute. If there's a need to protect federal funds or equipment, if there's a need to protect the interests of the whistleblower or the subject of the allegations in that matter, And of course, if the alleged incident is going to be reported publicly, you wouldn't like it to appear in the newspaper, on television or radio before the federal government that funded the grant is notified of the problem. Okay. And if there's a possible criminal violation involved, you must notify the federal government. Now, a few years back, the journal Nature published this survey that they did, where they looked at various behaviors that they thought were inappropriate, and asked scientists at mid-early career or all stages of career whether they had participated in any of these behaviors. And obviously it was a confidential survey because they probably wouldn't admit to doing some of these things if they had to sign their name to it. So very few scientists admit to actually falsifying their research data, 0.3%. So that is somewhat heartwarming to note. But as we move down this list, unauthorized use of confidential information in connection with one's own research, 1.7% of all investigators. What could that mean? Like somebody that read a research grant and said, whoa, that's a good idea, or that's interesting data, I'm going to use it to further my own research, when it was confidential and inappropriate. Failing to present data that contradicts one's own previous research, 6%. Circumventing minor aspects of human subject requirements, 7%. Overlooking others' use of flawed data, 12%. Changing the design or methodology in response to pressure from a funding source, 15%. Okay. Publishing the same data in one or more publications, 5%. Inappropriately assigning authorship credit, so they're even admitting that they inappropriately did it, 10%. Withholding details of methodology. Well, why would one do that? Well, if you're trying to prevent your competitors from repeating your results and moving ahead of you, then you might not provide all the details in the paper. So the journals are trying to prevent that from occurring these days. Inappropriate research design, 13%. Dropping data points based on a gut feeling that they were inaccurate, 15%. And finally, inadequate record keeping, 27%. Well, I wrote the data down on a paper towel and I lost it. Oh well. Keep it in your lab notebook and make a copy. So we're going to move on to a few exciting but scary examples of scientific fraud that have occurred in the US, Europe, and Asia. This was one of the most egregious ones that occurred with a University of Vermont investigator, Eric Pohlman. He actually was sentenced to jail for this result, and $196,000 in fines and restitution, and a lifetime ban on federal funding. Okay, one of the worst scientific frauds in 20 years. He had to retract or correct 10 papers. What did he do? He filed 17 fraudulent grant applications to study the impact of menopause on women's health and the benefits of hormone replacement therapy. So not only was he providing fraudulent data, but this can affect the health and the welfare of the individuals that rely on this data, physicians making decisions in terms of hormone replacement therapy and so forth based on this fellow's falsified data. So you can see why he got a severe sentence, okay? He fabricated test results in his long-term study of health effects in menopause. He claimed that hormone replacement therapy helps slow weight gain after menopause based on fabricated data, and that got him a grant. And his lab technician, who was the person that blew the whistle, found that when women's blood pressure or cholesterol improved over time, he would sometimes reverse the dates of the test to make it seem like their health was declining in accordance with his theories. Okay? He destroyed electronic evidence, produced false testimony, false documents, influenced other witnesses, and so forth. So all in the pursuit of getting funding and papers, without the thought, apparently, that he would eventually be found out, and in fact, that he could have a negative effect on the health of the population. Now, this next one occurred in England. It's a famous case, particularly given the current issue with vaccines and the COVID pandemic. This fellow Wakefield produced an article linking the MMR vaccine to autism. And it was fairly soon after its publication found to be fraudulent. Small case studies with no controls, relied on parental recall and benefits. Over the following decade from when it was published, epidemiological studies consistently found no evidence of a link between MMR vaccine and autism. And a paper was retracted 12 years later. Okay. It was said by the British General Medical Council that it's flawed both scientifically and ethically. But a lot of damage was done as a result, and it continues to this day. The anti-vaxxer individuals will cite this study as vaccines causing autism when it's been scientifically refuted over and over again. So damage to public health continues, fueled by unbalanced media reporting, ineffective response from government, researchers, journals, and the medical profession. Not to say anything further about the money that's been diverted away from efforts to understand the real causes of autism and to help children and families who live with it, instead of blaming vaccines. So we may work on much more arcane areas, but research can have very serious health public policy consequences that need to be taken into account in terms of reproducibility and rigor. Here's another famous one, publication of papers in science from Seoul National University in Korea, where the individual lab said that they've come up with human embryonic stem cells. It turned out that there was fabrication of this, and in fact, there was forcing of some of the female technicians in the lab to donate eggs for this study. This had an interesting wrinkle in terms of authorship, because at least for one of the papers, a very famous US stem cell researcher was recruited to be a co-author on the paper. He had not collaborated, he had interacted with these individuals, so he sort of became an honorary co-author on the paper, even though he had nothing to do with the research. And it was concluded the laboratory does not possess patient-specific stem cell lines or any scientific basis for having claimed to create one. So the paper was retracted, immediate and unconditional retraction of both papers. So the US scientist, while he was able to bask in the glory of a publication in science to which he really didn't contribute, now must bask in the shame of having the study refuted and the papers retracted. So pretty much goes to show that honorary scientific authorship without involvement in the paper is inappropriate. Here's another serious case. An individual in Japan who committed suicide as a result of scientific fraud by one of the individuals in his lab. So this was also a stem cell study where a Nature paper was published that they figured out a new method for creating stem cells. I think it was a salt shock that they would place these cells under. But this is a very competitive and high-powered field. So a lot of people tried to reproduce this result as soon as it was published, and they could not replicate it. Probe was launched. It also found that some of the study had been plagiarized. So this individual was the head of the lab. He consistently expressed remorse for not keeping a closer eye on the research, while continuing to argue that parts of the study held genuine breakthrough. But very sadly, he took this very much to heart, and he committed suicide as a result. And the editor of Nature said, Dr. Sasai was an exceptional scientist, extraordinary, left a wonderful legacy of pioneering work within the STEM field and other fields in developmental biology. Okay, this was very recent, just came out last month in Nature. Papers that are being produced by fake paper factories in China. Okay. Firms selling papers to researchers. It's not even research that's been done. They're just writing up papers. As far back as 2010, websites offering to ghostwrite papers on fictional research or to bypass peer review systems for payment in order to get this published. And the Chinese Ministry of Science and Technology said it would crack down on misconduct after a scandal in which 107 papers were retracted from the journal Tumor Biology. The peer reviews were fabricated, and the investigation from this group concluded that some had been produced by third-party companies. So lots of people, company out for making money. Others that physicians, for instance, that they're a target market because they're often required to publish research papers to get promotions, but they're so busy at the hospitals that they don't necessarily have the time to do the research. So maybe that's an unrealistic requirement. But this brings up another issue that you should watch out for, which is journals that are only interested in publishing papers based on the fees that you're going to pay them. So these journals, again, are only wanting to make money and therefore are not legitimate in the scientific realm, but it's very difficult sometimes to know when everything is freely available online, whether they're appropriate or not appropriate. Okay. So, yeah, somehow I managed to do that in exactly an hour. And what I'm going to try to do now is experiment and try to break our group into breakout rooms to discuss a few case studies, and then come back and maybe one spokesman from a room or two can give their insights. Okay, so if you haven't gone through this before, Anna is going to help me do this because for some reason I don't have the control. What we'll do, there's 50 of you, maybe we'll put you into 8 or so breakout rooms, and I will present the case study, and then each little group can just briefly discuss the case study, and then we'll come back and I'll ask a group or two that wants to give their input. Okay, so you could, I'd say when you get to the room, you could just introduce yourself to each other. This is a way you could communicate, which you haven't done. Probably most of you don't know each other. Very briefly, we'll just leave you in the room maybe for 8 minutes, something like that. Then you can discuss the case study. I'll put a summary of it into the chat so you could refer to that. You can pick a spokesperson if you want. And then if that spokesperson volunteers, they can give their input on the case study. So we'll give it a try for the first one. If it's a total failure, we could not do the next one or two. If it's great, we'll continue on. But I'll just point out that these are coming from a publication by the National Academy of Sciences and the National Academy of Engineering called On Being a Scientist. It's available for free at this URL. And I always tell my class, it's probably the best thing you can read in my entire class. It's very short. It'll take you a half hour or an hour to read. And it really covers the gamut of issues regarding scientific integrity. So let's give it a try. I'll read this over and then we can go into breakout rooms. So this is one called the selection of data, which we've talked a little about already. So a third-year graduate student, Deborah, and Kamala, a postdoctoral fellow, have made measurements of a new experimental semiconductor material using an expensive neutron test at a national lab. When they returned to their laboratory and examined the data, a newly proposed mathematical explanation of the semiconductor's behavior predicts results indicated by a curve. However, during the measurements at the national lab, they observed electrical power fluctuations they could not control or predict, and they were affecting their detector. They suspect the fluctuations affected some of their measurements, but they don't know which ones. Sounding like a dilemma here. So they begin to write up the results to present at a lab meeting, which they know will be the first step to preparing a publication. Kamala suggests dropping two anomalous data points near the horizontal axis from the graph they are preparing. You don't have to worry that much about all these details, but she says that due to the deviation from the theoretical curve, the low data points were obviously caused by the power fluctuations. The deviations were outside the expected error bars calculated for the remaining points. But Deborah is concerned about dropping the points. That might be seen as manipulating the data. She and Kamala could not be sure that any of the data points were affected by the power fluctuations. They don't know whether their theoretical prediction was valid. She wants to do a separate analysis that includes the points and discuss the issues at their lab meeting. But Kamala says if they include the points, others will think that the issue important enough to discuss in a draft paper, which will make it harder to get the paper published. Getting difficult. She and Deborah should use a professional judgment to drop the points now, is what she says. So here are the questions. What factors should they take into account in deciding how to present the data from the experiment? Should they talk about the fluctuations? Should they drop the data points? Should the new explanation predicting the results affect their deliberations? Should a draft paper be prepared at this point? If they can't agree on how the data should be presented, should one of them consider not being an author on the paper? What are the options here? Okay. Basically, the summary is they have some anomalous data points. They don't know whether to include them or not. What should they do? Okay, so Anna, if you are able, please break people into the breakout rooms. What you'll see on your screen is you're assigned to a particular breakout room. If you click on that, you can join the room. You know, if you're really super shy or you have something that you really need to do otherwise, then you don't have to join, but
How
give
many,
it a shot and see.
Okay, there are 49 people so
Okay.
far. So I'll break them into 5 rooms or just
Why don't we go to 7, something like that.
oh, okay. Okay.
And I'll just hang out here. And you'll give them 8 minutes.
Here we go.
Great, thank you.
Here we go.
Anna, can you tell how many people have entered the room?
For
18 people.
Okay, so anybody else that's still here is welcome to join the rooms. Well, while so many of you are still here, does anyone have any questions or comments that they wanted to discuss?
Sandy, you didn't discuss the, you sort of, oh, well, a general philosophy of citations, not really what's required or not, but what's appropriate. So, for example, I usually try and cite the original paper in an area and then a very recent current paper at a minimum. And what I see in the literature is that people aren't citing the original papers, which is the source of the idea, and I think it is totally inappropriate, but it seems to be the direction.
That's a good point. I think, sometimes people will cite review articles or something like that instead of the original source. Really, the original source is important. And another issue is that for things of, in quotes, general knowledge, then typically things are not cited. So you don't cite, when you say DNA is double-stranded molecule, you don't cite Watson and Crick's original Nature paper or something like that every
true.
time. So yeah, it's a fine line, but clearly where a seminal discovery was made, and that's what you're talking about in detail, citing the original work is a good idea.
Or even basing your work on, it's just a change in culture that I don't think is right, but in my field, and you mentioned it later on, but pretty much the expectation is there's going to be a publicly available database that holds the data and the metadata. Both the agencies, NSF, and the journals tend not to want it to be, say, a university-based database. They want it to be something that's, with some guarantee it's going to be there over the long haul, but I don't know how long anyone can guarantee anything like that, but yeah. And then the use of supplemental information is interesting. It's getting where the supplemental is often longer than the paper.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Of course, acting as a reviewer for some of these tomes is monumental amount of work as well.
Well, and that brings up an ethical problem or question for me. Why should you have volunteer reviewers if the journal is for profit?
Well, their answer would be that they would have to dramatically increase their cost of the journal if they did that.
Or cut their profits.
Yeah, well, that's not on the table. Yeah.
Time is up.
Okay, great. Yeah, people are coming back. We'll see how this works or doesn't work. So could someone tell me if you saw my summary that I put into the chat box when you were in the breakout room? Out of curiosity.
We were
No?
unable to see. So could you please, we were unable to see your summary, but could you please put back your slide where
Yes,
was the problem
I will.
description, because it contained a couple of points and we discussed only few.
Okay.
So I'm afraid that we might skip one of those.
Yes. Oops. So the general questions were, what information should they take into account on how to present the data from the experiment? Should the new explanation predicting the results affect their deliberations? Should a draft paper be prepared? And if they can't agree, should they, one of them, not co-author the paper? So is there a brave soul out there that wanted to just briefly discuss what your group concluded or suggested?
Let me try. This is another. We were in room number 3, and we were like 5 or 6 of us. Unfortunately, we could not read all of these questions, but the general idea what we came up with was that, well, they need to describe all of the deviation in the paper. They need to justify in their findings why did they take out these 2 data or 2 points. They need to provide some kind of explanation. What's the reason of neglecting those data? They need to provide some kind of theory or explanation. Why do they think so? And it's up to the reviewer later on journal if they say that no, it's not good, and reject the paper for publishing, or ask them to conduct additional research on that. Related to the last question, we could not complete our discussion because one of them was the graduate student, one of them was the postdoc. Okay, so I think it was up to the PI, principal investigator, to stick with one of the hypotheses, and if someone does not want to be part of this, it's up to them. And maybe this is the controversial part of our answer. Thank you.
Thank you. That was very thorough. And here are some insights that they provided in the answer section of the book, but they're not really answers. So they have to describe what they've done. They should answer the questions. If they state in the paper that data have been rejected because of problems in the power supply, maybe they should still include those points, okay? How should they determine which points to keep and which to reject? What type of error analysis should be done to include and exclude the questionable data? So maybe doing both sets of analyses. Should they look at the power fluctuations? Are there fluctuations that justify repeating the experiments? And as Nodar just said, consult with the principal investigator or senior researcher may provide additional options. So I think you hit on most of the points. And really the main issue here is that these are difficult questions, and they just require that people discuss them thoroughly and with an open mind, and come to the best conclusion and most honest conclusions in terms of presenting the data. So I think at this point, Walt, I'm going to ask whether you would like me to do one more, or should we just open it for questions?
Let's see, where are we? 2:30. I think, well, I don't know, Sandy, what do you recommend? You know what the other problem is.
Yeah.
I would prefer to have one or two even exercise, because this is very interesting for everyone.
Okay, very, very good. Let's do one more and see how that goes. Okay, this one is 2 young faculty members, Marie, an epidemiologist in the medical school, and Yuan, a statistician in mathematics, have published 2 well-received papers about the spread of infections in populations. Okay, so very relevant. As Yuan is working on the simulation he has created to model the infections, he realizes that a coding error has led to incorrect results that were published in the 2 papers. He sees with great relief that correcting the error does not change the average time it takes for an infection to spread, but the correct model exhibits greater uncertainty in its results, making predictions about the spread of an infection less definite. When he discusses the problem with Marie, She argues against sending corrections to the journals where the 2 earlier articles were published. She says both papers will be seen as suspect if we do that, and the changes don't affect the main conclusions in the papers anyway, she says. The next paper will contain the results based on the corrected model, and Yuan can post the corrected model on his webpage. So the questions are, what obligations do the authors owe their professional colleagues to correct the published record? How should their decisions be affected by how the model is being used by others? And 3, what other options exist beyond publishing a formal correction? Now, let me try putting the summary into the chat before you move to the rooms. So I don't know if that will stick with you when you move to the room or not, but there are the questions. What obligations do the authors owe their colleagues to correct the record? How should the decisions be affected by how the model is being used by others? And what other options exist beyond publishing a formal correction? So I think, Anna, you can go ahead and break the group up.
Do we need to break the group, or we can discuss even here?
We could discuss as a whole, if there are people that are willing to discuss. That's the question. Let's see if anyone else is brave. Yeah, I think let's go with the breakouts because people are more chatty in a smaller group.
I've split people in 5 groups.
Okay, good. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I'll have to say goodbye. Thanks a lot for including me in today's event. On behalf of the embassy, it was a great pleasure. And if there's any follow-up questions, I've included my email address, and I'm sure Chris, the cultural attaché, will join these sessions probably next week or after. Thank you.
Well, thanks for your presentation, for joining us, Irakli. Nice meeting you. Look forward to working with you in the future.
It's a pleasure, definitely. Thanks a lot. Have a good night. Bye.
Okay, you too. See ya. You give this course every year, Sandy?
Yes.
How
although
many students?
it's about 20 to 25
Mhm.
cell molecular grad students.
Mhm.
But this fall will be my last one.
How do you feel about that?
Mixed emotions, I guess. But the lab will still keep going.
So you're FERPing now, right?
Yeah, well, next year is my last year,
Yeah, yeah.
but my grant was just renewed for 5+1 year, so
Great. Congratulations.
thanks.
Are you able to stay on for a few minutes after we finish the session?
Sure.
Right.
3 more minutes.
Okay. I think we're kind of nearing the time where you wanted to wrap it up. Is that right, Walt?
Yeah, we'll have the question and answer period. So we've got and closing remarks. So yeah, we're getting to where we should be. Now you've got actually, let's see, we've got 11. Yeah, we're getting to where the schedule has you ending the formal part. Nodar will, who was speaking in the last section, will handle general questions and answers.
Okay.
And then we'll wrap it up by on the hour, if not before.
Okay.
And colleagues, if anyone has a question, please send it to me in private chat or write it here in general chat as well. So
Does Georgia like to stay up late like this, or people go to bed now?
we are more night owl type of society.
Like Spain?
Before everyone joins, may I ask some questions?
Sure.
Dr. Bernstein, maybe. It's not a question. Maybe I'm interested to hear your ideas about, like, for instance, how the authors should select the proper impact factor journal for their particular publication. What are the criteria? What are the experience? This is one. And also, you know, the funding agency requires certain number of publication per grant or something, and how to avoid artificial splitting on one paper into the multiple one.
Mm-hmm.
And to which is, you know, quite a common practice, as we know, just to meet the formal requirements of the, let's suppose, NIH or even NSF. So these two questions would be good to answer. Those are my questions. It would be good to hear your opinions on that.
Did you want me to address those now or wait till after we discuss the case?
I think time is over and we can ask audience to.
Yeah.
30
So,
seconds.
30 seconds? Okay.
Uh-huh.
All right, so let's get them back. We'll briefly discuss the case and then I'll segue into your questions, Nodar.
And one more question. I mean, this is from the journal standpoint. So how the journal decides to publish a paper when we have 2 or 3 blind reviewers, one is for publishing, another is against, sending the third independent one, or asking reviewer or asking authors to, you know, to tweak their paper or go back and do some additional research. What is the framework here, general framework, and what's this common practice?
Okay, I think we're back. So is there a spokesperson from one of the groups that would be willing, now that we have a relatively small group here, to just state how you felt about each of these issues? Same thing. Well, you get extra credit if you do this. Same thing I face in my classes. Okay, well, let's see what they said here. When the scientific record contains errors, other researchers can repeat those errors or waste time and money discovering and correcting them. Marie and Juan, the authors of the paper, have published erroneous results that could mislead other researchers. How should they tell the editors of the journals where the published papers appeared about the errors and publish corrections? Well, they can inquire directly with the journal as to what they think is the best editorial policy to follow. That would be one way around it. Anybody have any other ideas? Are they obligated to do it?
I think they are, because this concerns the epidemiology, and this concerns the public health. And this is especially important because this type of error might affect someone's life. So they must contact directly to the journal. They must state it in their next publication. They need to mention inside the previous paper. They need to acknowledge that they were wrong and this is the new one, and do all the best to improve their errors. This is my idea.
Yeah. I mean, of course, a person is worried that maybe the journal will say that that error was so severe that you need to retract the paper. And that, you know, there's no across the board policy on making these decisions. They're left up to the journal editors. And, you know, I think Nodar just asked a few questions while the groups were getting back from the breakout rooms that reflect on journal policies. For instance, how to decide which journal to submit your paper to. Well, I think that typically involves a discussion amongst the members of the authorship, but typically the senior author, the PI, and the person or persons that have done the majority of the work would make that decision. I know of a lot of cases where, you know, the first author, so enthusiastic, their first paper perhaps, they want to send it for sure to the top journal. There's no way it cannot get in, and, you know, they really want to try it. And I also know of a lot of cases where the PI just says, okay, we'll try it. And of course, it is rejected maybe without review, but the PI might have known better in that case. So what's the best thing? You always want to publish it in the most prestigious journal, of course, but there are other considerations. You know, some of these online journals are moving up in terms of their quality and eminence. Some of the older ones like Nature and Science, they're still up there. But, you know, how do they decide whether a paper is going to be accepted or not? Well, first, for these top flight journals, so-called, they make an editorial decision on whether they're even going to send it out for review. And that can be seen as, maybe it's based on the reputation of the senior author. Shouldn't be the case. Maybe it's based on the quality of the data. That should be the case. Maybe it's based on just what the editors think is interesting or topical. All of a sudden, a stem cell paper is published 2 days after it's submitted, just because they think it's such hot stuff. Maybe that ends up being a problem when the peer reviewers look at it in more detail. So there's a lot of human decision-making and errors too in this review process. The same paper can go to 2 different journals and get very different reactions. So, the main thing is to learn from the reviews that you get. If you get some negative reviews and the journal doesn't want to publish it, there may still be some nuggets of wisdom that are in the reviewers' reports that can be incorporated into the paper to make it stronger and resubmit it elsewhere. Many papers are resubmitted multiple times to the same journal or to other journals. So don't get discouraged. Try to learn something from the process, and try to rely on some senior people that have been through it a few times to know what's realistic in terms of where to send it and when a study is really complete enough to publish. Nodar, did I cover all of your points? Is there something else?
Another question was related to artificial splitting of the paper.
Yeah.
What's the strategy here?
Right. So that was actually one of the other case studies. So you could read the book and look at that. But it was where 2 authors, grad students wanted split to 2 papers, and the PI wanted 1 paper because it would have more impact. You were bringing up, well, the PI might want 2 papers because it looked better on the grant application to have 2 publications. Well, we're all in the same business, and you would think that the reviewers would not just be counting numbers and look more into the quality and depth of the papers, but it's true that it doesn't always happen. So, there's no golden rule on how to decide this, but each, in terms of splitting it, each paper should stand on its own and make a substantial point. If it relies too much on the data on the other paper or would be judged relatively weakly as a weak paper, then probably combining them would be better. I mean, I know of cases where people have submitted 2 papers to a journal and the editor liked them, but the reviewers said, hey, combine them into 1, then it'll be really good paper. So probably the authors were happy and disappointed at the same time. Get published, but half as many papers.
One more question, if I may.
Yes.
What are the criteria of selecting the reviewers from the journal standpoint? I mean, how the journals select the good reviewers versus not so good, because it depending in some cases, reviewer accepts all of them. Sometimes they reject all of them. So based on what criteria journals decide to select this person over another. And I can give you the some personal kind of example. So my PI in one of the US universities used to receive the papers for reviews. He was very famous, and he used to give us to postdocs these papers to review. And we used to collect this, we reviewed this, and he used to take some of those which he thinks that it was good. He thought it was good, and after that, but usually it was not his review, it was postdocs reviews. And I think it's not the best sometimes for reviewers to do so. What's your opinion on that?
I agree. Some of the journals, I mean, they know that this is happening, and they have decided that they want you to note if you have consulted a colleague or asked a junior person to review it. Another possibility is to put a checkbox and ask them that if they have a postdoc that is appropriate to review it, then they can send the paper to the postdoc instead of to the PI who is having it ghost written for them. I mean, personally, the only thing I've done in that regard, I guess I may have had a postdoc look at a paper or two that I thought they were qualified, and they can give me some opinions, but I would end up writing the review just to get some more in-depth information. In terms of deciding who the reviewers are, many of the journals, at least in biomedical field, will ask for suggestions. I mean, you have to pick people that you're not collaborating with or best friends with, and they often will consider and use them. And you're probably the best person that would know who would review your paper favorably, or at least is in the field and would understand your paper well. But they also will use members of their editorial board in somewhat related areas, or they'll just go through the references in your paper and pick someone that's mentioned multiple times. And then there are computer programs now that will, take the information in your paper and spit out potential reviewers that can be asked. But, a savvy editor, of course, will know whether a reviewer does a good job or not, or just rejects papers out of hand with a sentence or two, and that would be an appropriate way of treating work that had been done over years and months, writing it up and so forth. So, a lot of it comes down to having editors that are willing to do their job, which is time consuming in and of itself.
Sandy, oh, sorry, are you
one of the interesting things that I found in the US, and it's not the practice here in Georgia, journals used to ask authors to name the persons who we do not want it to be a reviewer of our journals due to some, how should I say, rival from the rival lab or some personal issues,
Right.
which is not common here in Georgia.
Yes, that a number of the journals allow that as well in their computerized system for submission. Sometimes you have to state what the reason is, if it's a conflict of interest or a competitor or whatever. Yeah, that, it's as much psychology and human relations as it is science.
Yeah. Sandy, could I just comment on and amplify a couple of things you said? One is that journals like Nature, Nature is commercial, and it acts like a commercial company. So it will not accept a paper often if they've published something in a similar area recently, and it has nothing to do with the quality of the paper, and it isn't necessarily in exactly the same area. So it's not that you're duplicating the results, but they just try and make sure that they're topical and they increase the likelihood of being picked up. And then I just wanted to tag on to that there, as you said, there are humans involved, and there's lots of reasons for being rejected, and not to give up. And the exact same paper, depending on who the editor is and the reviewers are, can get 3 excellent reviews or can be rejected. And then the last thing I just wanted to say as a recommendation is to really, if you think, even if the reviewer has misunderstood what you're saying, consider the comments and see if you could have said it more clearly so they didn't misunderstand. because the reviewers in general are trying to do a good job, and if they misinterpreted what you said and maybe turned it down for a reason that wasn't justified, maybe it could have been presented more clearly that would have resulted in it being accepted. And then the last thing I wanted to say is there's lots of reasons for picking a journal, and one of them is the impact factor, and how prestigious the journal is. But another one is who the audience is, and depending what audience you want to affect or have the biggest impact on, that can really determine where you send the journal. Go ahead.
No, I see we have a question from Leila.
Yes, if I may. Hello once again. Thank you very much. Very interesting points. My question is about sending an article for publication, following the predetermined rules that we get, for example, for a journal, following them up step by step, word for word. But sometimes we get two reviewers having completely different opinions about it, though the rules have been kind of followed completely, and to the point where the author feels really discouraged because we've put a lot of effort in following up the rules, but still the comments are weird because of certain reasons. What would be your kind of bird's eye view of that?
Well, typically, I think Nodar suggested they might send it out to a third reviewer. But on the other hand, an editor will often go with the negative review and say, these are concerns that either need to be addressed or it's just not appropriate here. So you can always appeal an editor's concerns or a reviewer's concerns, or state why you don't believe that this is appropriate. But then it really comes down to the human point where, an editor will just stand their ground or may say, yes, that's fine. Sometimes they're told to reject a paper, no matter if it's, whatever the point is. Even if a paper, it's all in code somehow. People that are submitting papers for the first time may not understand that, I'm sorry, we cannot accept your paper. Here are the critical comments from the reviewers. If you wish to address them, please send them back. Now, someone that's been in the field for years may look at them and say, oh, these are very simple to address. We can just send it in, whereas essentially accepted. Whereas a new investigator may look at that and say, oh, I've been rejected, it's terrible. So there's the human factor, but there's no doubt that there are bad reviewers out there that make inappropriate comments. So there's not too much to lose by trying to appeal, except time.
For example, I had a case with my doctoral student where we had an article about an issue, and the reviewer said that he would welcome rewriting the paper as a case study, whereas our aim was not at all to have a case study. It was a kind of, let's say, sequence of events, and whatever the purpose of our article was that. And he insisted on rewriting it as a case study, and then we sent it to the third reviewer, and he gave a balanced review completely. The reason I'm asking this in that mode is that they keep changing the goalposts, and what should we do as PhD, let's say as PhD advisors or PhD student kind of advisors? What's then? Because as soon as we follow the standard, whatever it is, suddenly you have a reviewer who turns everything upside down.
I feel your pain. What can I say?
So that's the fact of life, right?
Yes. Unfortunately, it's human relations.
Yes.
Yeah, I would just add that sometimes the reasons are not the real reason. Sometimes a paper or even a proposal, the reviewers don't want to see it move forward. And so they list reasons. You can fix those reasons. It's still not going to move forward.
Yes.
And so part of the game is to sort of try and guess at and understand if it's something you can fix for that journal or you should move on to another journal.
And there can also be a bias, right, sir? Because, for instance, my PhD candidate is doing a PhD on Donald Trump's communication style in building international relations, effectiveness of Trump's communication style. And normally in research writing, we have a phenomena in one period of time and phenomena comparing different periods of time. And by the time we would defend the PhD, who knows what happens with Trump and his communication style and his impeachment, etc., etc. Therefore, one of the reviewers kind of said that he completely disapproves the way Trump communicates because his way of communicating is not effective. Well, we had an argument that he won the first elections with this effective communication style, and he almost won this present one. There was just very little difference between him winning and Biden winning, right? So should we really have a kind of fourth world war with that type of reviewer?
Oh,
Okay.
Oh,
Thank you.
okay, I think we need to stop this question and answer and discussion. I'd like to thank you, Sandy, for your time and insight and experience. Good discussion, great presentation. And of course, I'd also like to thank Irakli Milani as well. I just want to remind those of you that are still online that the application period is still open for the grants to support 3 or more months of research in the US. So if you're interested in that, there's a few days left to apply. Anna, Halil, the JD advisors are all standing by to help you out with any questions or recommendations. And as I said earlier, I think the main thing is to find a major professor or mentor at San Diego State that is interested in similar areas to you that you would like to have you in the lab and that you can work on a mutually interesting project with. So probably the best thing to do, I mean, you can check with the JD advisors, they'll have recommendations for you, but I would go directly to the web and the doctoral programs and seek out faculty that are doing research in areas that you're interested in. But I think it's a great opportunity. There's a fellowship, travel is supported, and it's a chance to experience another educational system while you're doing your PhD in Georgia.
Are the fields restricted?
Pardon me? Oh, the emphasis is on STEM, STEM fields or interdisciplinary fields with a strong STEM component.
Okay.
So there's got to be, the intent is to support STEM in Georgia, so there has to be a significant science, technology, engineering, math component. One of those 4. Okay, well, with that, thank you again, Sandy, Nodar. Thank you for handling the discussion, and thank you those of you that are still in line for hanging in there. And Nodar.
thank you, Dr. Bernstein, for your outstanding presentation. And I would like to ask you to convey our best regard to Dr. Stanley Malloy, who did a lot of things to develop our SDSU Georgia project in the early days. So thank you very much.
Yes, I will. Thank you.
Thank you. We will see you all. Bye. Maybe I'll, can I send you another Zoom link, Sandy?
Yeah, that would be fine.
Okay, I'll do that now.
Okay.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Thank you, Sandy. Bye.
Bye.